On a train, in a bus, in a car, on the way to your job. All alone with your kids, with your wife, or with your dog. You can listen anywhere, you can listen everywhere, to the Philip Maloney podcast.
Hi, welcome back to the latest installment of the Philip Maloney podcast. I'm very pleased to be joined by my good friend, Deborah Powney. Deborah's joining me today after a bit of a discussion that we had sort of offline, and we found a mutual interest in a subject called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And she's been doing a lot of detailed studies into this, and I brought her along today to share some of that with us. So welcome, Deborah.
Hi, thanks. Nice to be back again.
Yeah. This is becoming a very nice regular occurrence. I do enjoy it.
It is, yeah. It's good fun, and it actually starts to link together some of the subjects that we've discussed. So I was just going through some information before we came on, and my field, for those that haven't seen me on here before, is looking at recovery for male and female victims of domestic abuse, and domestic abuse is a wider field, although in particular my studies tend to be on male victims currently. But when you look at domestic abuse from a scientific perspective, you see all the different threads that fit into that, because I don't subscribe to the notion that domestic abuse is caused by patriarchal theory. I'm firmly based in science and robust evidence. So adverse childhood experiences has an impact both as maybe a cause of domestic abuse and an outcome of domestic abuse. So it's interesting to see how these things fit together.
Yeah, so that's I suppose in this day and age that could be quite controversial aspect to have, especially to be studying at such a high level. So it's a really important area. But can I ask you, just before we sort of go into our main subject, you mentioned the domestic abuse and it being did you say a sort of like a product of the patriarchal? Just explain that a little bit.
Okay, yeah. So
just so people can kind of understand.
To put it in a very, very small nutshell, and I'll try and stop myself thumping the table and having my usual rant. There are two, what could be described dramatically, I suppose, as two warring factions within the field of domestic abuse. There is what is labelled the gendered model, which is led by a feminist theory and essentially core of patriarchal theory, which I'll explain in a second.
Right.
And then there's what's labelled a family violence section, or gender inclusive area. And essentially it's two groups. One that says patriarchal theory, which is based on, although there's a lot of different elements to feminism, just like there's a lot of other elements to Christianity, say, they do have some core beliefs, again, just like a religion would. So for feminist theory, they believe that our society is set up by men for men and use their power to oppress women to gain certain social advantages.
Right.
And I've been spending a lot of I'm currently writing up my thesis, and as part of your thesis you set out in a chapter what your framework is, what your beliefs are, what your philosophy is, and how that is going to impact on your research.
Right.
And a part of that is I have two supervisors, and one of them I think would still describe herself as a feminist. And because of that, I'm pushed to understand what it is I don't agree with. So, which I think is incredibly lucky, and it makes me a robust researcher. But my notion, and there's a lot of people that share this, is that this is an ideology, it's theory, but that's all it is, because what's happened is that you can create a framework within a scientific paper or within any paper and say, this is my framework, and this is what I'm going to be researching and reporting. And then you need to get that published and peer reviewed. But if you go to a particular journal that has that particular interest and those particular beliefs as its core tenet as well, and all the people peer reviewing that work share the same beliefs, it's not going to be challenged.
Yeah.
So, and then it gets published, and then more and more get published, and then it becomes knowledge. You know, as soon as you hit a certain critical mass, it becomes knowledge, and then people start referencing that. And that's literally, I have books that I've been going through all the different kind of reports and literature that have come out recently in the UK around the domestic abuse bill, and I've been noticing repetitive references to certain literature. So these are the literature that I've gone back and read, and I'm seeing that it's not based on evidence, and no evidence or no references are given when you go back to the absolute primary source. And I'm talking 1986, 1988, 1977, when all this was coming to fruition, and it was all being I suppose created as far as his movement and domestic abuse was concerned. And it's based on belief, not evidence.
Okay, that gives us a good understanding of that sort of area. So the peer review that you're privy to or subject to now was a bit looser back in the 1980s, and as a result of that,
it existed.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably would have existed in many, academic areas, I mean, if you look at sort of, the Stephen Hawking's movies and stuff like that, you see the ridicule of other peers saying, like, that's absolute sort of hogwash, this is rubbish science or what have you, they sit up and they legitimize it.
And that's but that's part of scientific method, as much as it can be really, it can really sting when you get feedback, it is part of scientific rigor.
But it makes it good, and it makes it have to stand up to certain levels of scrutiny. Let's crack on with ACEs. Tell me about ACEs. Tell me like a real sort of high level view. What is it?
Okay, so adverse childhood experiences. I came across this. This wasn't a distinct part of my study area, but I came across this working for part of the university, and they were commissioned by Lancashire Victim Violence Reduction Unit, which is a fantastic unit, very proactive, really drills down into finding solutions for any kind of violence that's happening. But they wanted to pull together a report of resources where anyone that was interested in this, and they've got this amazing website, I think we're going to look at it shortly, where you can click on various different resources there, but they wanted a report that pulled together easily accessible resources for anyone that was concerned or interested in, here we go, in ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Myself and Professor Nichola Graham-Kevan pulled together a report that is a whole load of free to access resources for ACEs, and I've got films and videos, I've got infographics, I've got reports. There is also, I put in 100 peer-reviewed open access articles, scientific articles, and that's the last one down. And it took me a heck of a lot of time to get all these different articles, but the reason I wanted them to be open access is that anyone can click on any of these blue links here and get directly to the article without having to pass a paywall, which some articles can cost you like £40 for 24 hours just to borrow them. And I wanted this to be open to anyone within Lancashire, obviously, including the violence reduction unit, but also anyone that went on there that was a service provider, that was looking at creating a program. Because again, even if all these 100 articles only cost, I was going to say £10, but they never cost £10, say £20 each, and you wanted 50 of them, that's a lot of money for someone who's trying to write a report for themselves or to get published. So I did a lot of digging around to get that. But also there is a lot of information out there, but again, if it's not in one place. So the online learning section, that online service there, there's a load of modules, and they are really small videos on YouTube. So it's like 5 minutes, 9 minutes, what this sort of stuff, and you can go through them. And if you're not someone who wants to read articles and just wants to sit there for 5 minutes and watch a YouTube video, this takes you through. So by the end of these courses, these little snapshot courses, you'll have a top line understanding of what ACEs are, what kind of impact it can have, and also what kind of factors you can put into place to as protective factors or offset any potentially negative effect. So it's an excellent resource, and I can't say how fantastic it was to work for Lancs VRN to actually want something like this. But to give you just a top line element to this, because I know there's a lot of stuff sort of flying around social media at the moment that again doesn't seem to be based in evidence. It's all about you are not your ACEs or this kind of stuff, and I think that's said with hopefully good intent, but I think sometimes it can lead people down a route of misunderstanding, because of course you are not your trauma or things that have happened to you, but that doesn't mean to say that you could or should ignore them, or that you shouldn't have the ability to understand them, so that you don't so that you're not ruled by them. Often we're ruled by emotions if we don't understand what's going on.
So like the difference between sort of turning your back on your fears and actually facing your fears, or
just understanding them, understanding that there might be things you do that you don't like about yourself, or you don't understand why that's happening. Might give you some context, and once you get the context to something, it gives you agency. It gives you the power to either be able to reach out for help for someone if you don't feel that you have the capacity yourself, which we often don't. I've found myself in situations where I've needed counselling, or I've needed some kind of outside intervention. But understanding can often be the first step to understanding your own journey.
And I think that's a powerful point, really. One thing that I did see in here, and I hope I can find it quite quickly, because I thought it was very, very interesting. I think it might be on one of these down here as well. There was a number of different ways that you can have be impacted with the ACEs. Did that expand for you there? I've just expanded it on my desktop.
Okay. I've got a slightly different one, but it's exactly the same, more or less. So what it is there tend to be a top 10 of adverse childhood experiences that are known to have impact, and that impact is both psychological and physiological, which is often not necessarily considered. So there's 10, and they fall into three areas. The first area is classed as abuse, and I think on that one that you expanded before, the top one there, there's physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And then there's neglect, and that can be emotional neglect and physical neglect. So you can actually keep someone alive. You can feed them and clothe them and keep them warm, which I would class as physical neglect. But if you're not tending to a child's emotional issues, that's also neglect. And I'm not saying there's a lot of other stuff that goes on that it's not always intentional. Neglect or abuse is not always intentional, and again that can be controversial, but there's other things that come through that. And then there's on this particular diagram you've got up is called household dysfunction, but I've got it as household challenges. And that can be mental illness. So if your family unit is dealing with a parent that has a mental illness, substance abuse, so whether that be drug addiction or alcohol or those kind of things. There is domestic violence and abuse. An incarcerated parent, so a parent that is in prison, can have be an adverse childhood experience, as can parental separation or divorce. And when I was talking before about how these things are often interwoven, this is what I'm talking about. So as a child, you could be in a household where there is domestic abuse, whether that be and I'm being heteronormative here, shall we say? So whether that be against mum against dad, or mum and dad engaging in abusive behaviour. And that domestic abuse, again, I don't believe in patriarchal theory, that domestic abuse might be caused by mental illness and or addiction. So
I see,
before you started, you've already got 3 adverse effects going on there, if that's happening. But then if they divorce as well and things get nasty, not only have you lost a parent that's in your everyday life, but if then we start putting in things like parental alienation, where there's still abuse going on in a different form, and that child is separated from that parent and then maybe told bad things about that parent, then you've hit 4 adverse childhood effects before anything else,
which becomes a massive situation to deal with. So how do children tend to deal with those disruptions in their childhood?
Well, they can. It can manifest in a number of ways, and it can be acted out. It can be aggressive, violent behaviour. It can be antisocial behaviour. It can be the opposite and be withdrawn, completely isolated. It's being aware of the causes that can make children behave in certain ways. But the reason, just stepping back slightly, the reason I was making a bit hoo-ha about the number 4 is that there's a lot of indicators around the number of adverse effects and how they accumulate on the possible outcomes. Now, these adverse childhood experiences, I must give a caveat at, because this is where I think this message of you are not your A.C.Es comes from.
Yes.
Everything in psychology and behavioral sciences is a possibility or an indicator, and that indicator has more or less strength, but it doesn't necessarily make it an absolute outcome. So you might be a child who has experienced a lot of adverse childhood effects, but although there's a more likelihood that you might behave in a certain way or experience certain things, it's not an absolute. You know, there might be things in your life, you might be naturally more resilient. You might have an influential adult that you can trust and turn to, which is seen as a protective factor in A.C.Es. There's a lot of other things going on. So what I'm going to talk about are indicators, not absolute outcomes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a very important caveat to put down. Yeah.
So there's an indicator that if, as a child, you experience 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you have, and I'm reading this off a list because I can never remember it.
Sure.
3 times levels of lung cancer, and that might be caused from physiological effects of trauma, or increased smoking, which tends to happen when you're very stressed out, or those kind of things. You've got 11 times the chance of substance misuse and addiction, 14 times the suicide ideation of someone that hasn't experienced adverse childhood effects, 4 times as likely to have begun to have sexual intercourse by the age of 15, 4.5 times likely to develop depression, and twice as likely to get liver disease, again from either the physiological effects of stress or increased drinking, or even things like not sleeping enough, or not eating properly, or exercising.
So
And there was
so
another.
these aren't just mental effects.
Ooh,
These are actual physical effects on you as a human being. Wow.
Yeah, and I want to put a bit more detail about that, because
Sure.
we all kind of know it, but we might not know why we know it is a kind of common factor. So we have a flight or fight system. Yeah, we're all aware of that, and that's a evolutionary system to keep us alive. And it was built in us because back in the day, if we were walking through the woods and a big tiger, saber-toothed tiger, or what was ever knocking about in the day, jumped out on us, we had to find a way of getting out of there alive. So either the fight, so we'd pick up a big stick and beat the crap out of it, or flight, and we would leg it and get the heck out of Dodge to survive. Okay, so our system is set up that if we come across a stress indicator that is endangering our lives, our system is called the Hpa system, and I can never say this, so let me find out. I wrote it down because it's the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Okay, now I call it HPA because I can never say it, and I've even written a paper with this in and always call it HPA. So what happens is your HPA kicks in, and what happens is it goes release adrenaline. So that rush that you get, and sometimes you feel it in your stomach. There's a whole physiological thing going there where the blood leaves your digestive system and goes to your limbs. So you can either pick up that big stick and whack the tiger, or you can leg it. And then what happens is cortisol gets released at the same time, which is your stress hormone. And that's where you get that thing where someone says, the world slowed down and I could see everything and I could smell everything and everything came into focus. So all that is set up so that if you come across a tiger and you need to get out of Dodge or kill the tiger, that's what happens. Yeah. Right. You've even seen it when people have mothers have lifted up cars from their children, that super strength.
Yeah, I was going to say car crashes and things like that tend to be people. I can't remember where I saw it. I think it was just on like another podcast somewhere where they said that they were in this car crash and they could see it happening and everything slowed down. And apparently where we sort of are frames per second, as it were. So our human brain sort of relaxes at about sort of 35, 40 frames per second. It spikes with an ability to sort of take in more information, and it kind of
that's because
feels slower.
Everything is switched on. Your adrenaline and your cortisol switches on, and you're aware of it. There's so much going on in your brain at that point. There's amygdala hijacks and all sorts of things. It's fascinating. I won't take you down that route. We'll be here.
No, but it is fascinating. You're right.
It's incredible because people say, "Oh, I didn't even think about it." Yourself, and I'll just slightly allude to this. Yourself, if you're driving along and someone pulls out on you, your foot hits that brake before you've even actually realised that someone's pulling out on you.
Yeah,
it's incredible. But so that system is set up to protect you. However, what happens is if your cave where you're supposed to be safe is where the danger is, and that system is on all the time, every time. All those things that are happening, the adrenaline and the cortisol just set you up completely to function at that level. So you're functioning in fear. Now, I said before that I wrote a paper about this. for my master's, I looked at female victims of sexual abuse and looked at resilience, vulnerability, and facial recognition. And what I found was that research shows that, and this was in female victims, I couldn't actually find any data on male victims, but so in female victims, if they have something called, or they have the possibility of having something called alexithymia, and that is a inability to recognize facial emotions. Okay. Right. Now, as human beings, we communicate not just through talking, but facial emotions. So if I suddenly started looking away like this, you can easily recognize that I'm disinterested or I don't understand or something like that.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
and we communicate like that. But I can also sense your mood from your face just by slight differences in your facial.
Yeah, like micro expressions. I think there's a lot of this within when people are diagnosed with autism. They find it very difficult to look at facial expressions, read facial expressions, understand what people are thinking, etc.
It happens in a similar part of the brain. So what happens is, in those situations, if you've been abused as a child, or if you've been abused as an adult, you can get or suffer from alexithymia. However, it happens from a slightly different aspect. If as a child you've experienced it, what happens is your cortisol levels, your HPA is functioning at a higher level. And I describe it as functioning like you've lost your car keys and you're trying to get out the door.
Right.
You're running around and they could actually be in your hand, but you're going, where are my keys? Where are my keys? And you can't see because you're at that, I've got to get out. I'm going to be late. I can't get out. Blah, 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 blah. So that's how they function. And what happens is the brain can get damaged from having all those hormones going around, those stress hormones going around in your brain. So it goes, so what happens in that is it kind of gets used to functioning at a higher level, but then it stops recognizing risk because it can't take any more capacity in the cortisol. So you can recognize when someone's going to abuse you because their face changes and it becomes a risk face. But it gets to the point where people have been so overloaded as a child and they are so overloaded with that HP axis that they can't take anymore. So the brain stops them recognizing danger cues. As an adult, what happens is if you keep getting that cortisol, it can actually damage your brain. And your brain will protect itself above anything else. Okay, that's what it's there is. That's why you fear things. That's why you get anxious, because your brain's trying to protect your body to protect itself.
Yeah.
So what happens then is the brain goes, we can't take any more of this cortisol because you're going to damage us. So we'll just switch it off. So again, you don't read the risk cues because your brain doesn't want to get flooded with cortisol. And it's a strange thing that you can have these elements where the HPA axis, something that is in you to protect you and is adapted to protect you, can become maladaptive and actually become stuck on.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. But it has an impact. And again, I wrote this down. It has an impact on the part of your brain that receives pleasure and reward. So that can lead to substance dependence. It also inhibits the prefrontal cortex, and that's responsible for impulse control and executive function. So what I said about maybe having sexual intercourse 4 times more likely before the age of 15 than those that haven't experienced this, because you're acting on impulse.
Yeah.
But your executive function is really important for learning. So as a child, if your executive function is being diminished and you're sat in school and you're not learning, or you're kicking off and all this kind of stuff, that combination.
Yeah.
But then it also has an impact on the amygdala, and the amygdala sits in sort of just above your sort of medium cortex. And that's where your fear sits. Now it will either spike it, so you live in constant fear, so everything is a threat and everything is like this, or it will just switch it off. so you don't have any fear. But whatever happens is, it leads to something called toxic stress. So that hyper functioning, people would describe it as PTSD or stressed out or whatever, not only has an impact on your behavior, your ability to bond and keep relationships or hold down a job or even function in society, it also has a massive effect on your physiological output, to the point, and I'm going to have to give a shout out to the woman who is absolutely leading this field, which is Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris.
Yes,
and
right.
she's listed on that report from Lancs.
Yeah, I'm going to put this link for this report in the description of the podcast, definitely. So
well,
people
she
can have a look at that.
wrote a book called The Deepest Well. It's also on Audible. I cannot recommend that book enough. I seriously, and I don't know the woman. She doesn't know I exist. I don't get any commission for it. I think everybody who has or deals with children should listen or read that book. I listened to it and I bought it because it's immense.
Right.
And she's all over YouTube. She will talk through all this much better than I do. But
So there's a
she's
TED
really
talk, isn't there?
There is a
her,
TED talk, yeah, and that's only sort of 15 minutes or something, I think. But there's other things where she's actually giving full lectures and full talks, and yeah, it's really worth your time. It really is. But then physiologically, it can reduce your lifespan by up to 20 years. So anyone that's got 6 or more of those adverse childhood effects has a greater likelihood of having this impact, and it can reduce your lifespan by up to 20 years. And that's because it can give you, I think it was 3 times the risk of lung cancer, 3.5 times the risk of heart disease, and then there's diabetes and obesity and all that on there. And so I started to dig a little bit deeper into how is this happening. I tend to find myself going down rabbit holes into research once I start.
No doubt.
Thing called telomeres, and I think you and I were briefly talking about it last time.
Wow, this really sparked my interest. Yeah, are you ready to go into this one?
Yeah. So
right, let's dive in.
Changing your physiological your physiology on a genetic level, okay, on a DNA level, okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds very overinflated, but again, there's all sorts of resources online that take it from absolute scientific breakdown into words that you can't even pronounce, right through to cartoons. So wherever you want to start on this, and I must admit, I started on a cartoon and then kind of worked my way up. But your DNA is literally a double helix. It's like a ladder that you can cut in half and then it's twisted. Okay, so these are joined like this. For those that don't know, most people do. And how we replicate our cells is that twisted double helix gets untwisted, broken in half, and then formulated with the other half. And various different elements match up. They're not the same. They don't mirror each other. So A will match with B from this side will match with C, and they all match up together.
Yeah.
At the end of your double helix, that twisted DNA, you have these things called telomeres. And they were first discovered as a kind of, this is how we age. And what happens is, I describe it, and I got it directly from this cartoon, as it's exactly like those little plastic things you get on the end of laces. So those little sort of plastic ends. And you can see when DNA is in a Petri dish, when it's dyed, you can see them on the ends. I saw one where the DNA had just formed and was about to split into its separate elements. And the ends of them were dyed bright pink. You could actually see them under a microscope, mind.
Sure.
And so what happens as you age, if you get through just a normal life, is as the DNA replicates, they take a little bit of a hit, and they get shorter and shorter and shorter. Excuse me. Now your DNA replicates like a flat pack instruction leaflet. All the DNA is how to make your cells. So you as your cells and you as a person replicate from your instructions mapped out in your DNA. Yeah. So those instructions are really important to have, okay, because you don't want those cells to start mutating into something bad, like that can cause illness or structural damage or disease or anything like that. So these little telomeres at the end, as they replicate, they get shorter and shorter and shorter. That's why you get wrinkles, because your skin doesn't replicate as well. Because what happens is, as they get shorter and shorter and shorter, once they start to disappear, little bits of the DNA, the instructions, get kind of broken. So say, for example, you were putting up an IKEA shelf, and the first bit said, take shelf A and attach it to screw D. If the first part of that is missing, shelf A, you're thinking, what do I attach to screw D now? What is it? Oh, I'll put that in there, and it might be wrong. Yeah. So this is how you're very reductionist, but this is how your body is replicating cells.
Yeah, no, for the Philip Maloney podcast purposes, this is a perfect level. Keep it here.
Yeah, no, fine. That's the way I think. But so what happens when you have trauma and all these stress hormones and stuff going on in your brain is that has an impact on your cells, and your telomeres that act like buffers to stresses and things that are going on in your body, they take an extra chunk. So rather than them lasting 80 years, you might have taken a chunk off with trauma and it only lasts 60 years, and then you get another bit of trauma and it's only 40 years, and then before you know it, half the instructions are missing on that. Do you know what I mean? So, and we even hear it in our lexicon, in our language, where you'll see someone who looks quite old, and then they'll go, oh, I'm 42, and you think, cracky, you've had a hard life. So we actually know this to be true, you know. So, but
they have had a hard life.
They've had a hard life, but it's actually manifested on a DNA level, and we're seeing the results of it in the way they're looking. So this can have such a detrimental effect on you that it causes you not only to have maybe to have a higher dependence on alcohol or drugs, or an inability to look after yourself, or an inability to form meaningful relationships, so that it then has a knock-on effect that you're lonely, or you might feel so bad that you now suffer from depression, and that leads you to suicide ideation or whatever. So you can see that the knock-on effect, the spiral of this, is immense, absolutely immense. And within that, again, going back not only to experiencing domestic abuse, which you then might go on because you can't form meaningful relationships, or because you've got some kind of attachment disorder, because you know you've been through all that as a child. But if you're a child experiencing that and they're your parents going through that, then this is the intergenerational thing that we're actually seeing here. So that adverse childhood experience then gets passed on to that child. But then parental alienation is another one layered on top of that. So this is all mounting. This isn't something that is isolated. This is accumulative.
What would be the factors within parental alienation for this to have an adverse effect? I mean, you know, where would the problem lie for the child or children to be affected by that sort of disruption, whether it be parental alienation or just divorce in itself?
It's attachment. We as human beings are social creatures, and we survive on attachment. We survive on attachment. Our babies are born incapable. This is not like, you know, the animal kingdom where you drop out a giraffe and 3 seconds later it stood up. You know, children, our bonds are there for a survival purpose. And I'm not some kind of biological exclusionist. I understand the impact of socialization and all those kind of things. Like I've always said, I'm a multivariate researcher. I see the factors that come in from all ends. However, as a child, your universe, your world is small. You know, you can have a perfectly normal childhood, and then your parents don't love each other anymore. And I'm talking no abuse, nothing at that point. One of them might have an affair. Okay, we're all human beings. It happens. Have an affair leads to a marital breakdown, leads to some bitterness, some want of revenge, or just some pain that person can't deal with, or whatever, leads to parental alienation. Okay, and all of a sudden that child is dealing with a parent that's desperately sad or bitter, angry, cross, upset, all of the above.
Yeah.
And children protect adults. You know, we know that. You know, they sit up there. Pippin. Pip. Farmers walk past. So they feel that they want to help a parent, whether it's male or female in there, but they will also have a bond, a loving, deep-seated emotional and mental bond with that other parent. Now, again, even if that parent is relatively okay with the other parent, and they're still not in their lives every day, they're still not waking up to mummy or daddy, they're still having to cope with all that loss and that grief. But if there's alienation involved, it adds so many layers of complexity, because then not only is that child wanting to look after the parent that's hurt and sad and lonely and confused and all the rest of it, but that parent is then saying to them bad things about the other parent that they love, and maybe telling them things that are not necessarily true. They might be true for that parent, but certainly not for the child. And before anyone starts putting a gazillion comments in this, I'm talking about safe parents here. I'm not talking about domestic abuse. I'm talking about safe parents. But we also know that even amongst safe parents, things go wrong. Okay. So you might have a parent that's just bitter, sad, lonely, all the rest of it, that's telling this little person, this child who loves the other person, the other parent, that they are bad, or that they don't love them, and they wouldn't have done this to me if they loved us. All of a sudden that child is being dragged in to that whole melee of adult emotion. Now, I imagine that's for that child, it's as gut-wrenching as asking a parent to choose between children. That's the basest way I can put it, to try and see. If you're a child, you are connected equally to your parents. So then asking them to choose is like asking a parent, choose a child. How could you do that? How you can't even fathom how you would choose one child over the other. In fact, it's so horrific, it was put in a film. It was to manifest horrific. Sophie's Choice. So that would be it's about Nazi Germany and making a mother choose which child she hands over to essentially camps.
Okay.
I got that far in and thought, that's me.
No thanks. Sorry, just to sort of pick into that scenario of parental alienation. You've got a child there, you've got a scenario where the child is feeling protective of the parent, etc. What are the physiological exposures the same as, say, one of the other sort of ACEs experiences that a child can have? Because I can imagine they are. There's a lot of things going on there, and it seems that there's sort of almost multiple things going on there?
It's never as simple as saying one of these and one of them and chunk the other. They're all interwoven here, because that child's going to be conflicted, because it loves the parent that's saying these things to them, but it also doesn't believe the parent that's saying these to them. And then you get cognitive dissonance going on, which causes actual pain, actual physics. You'll have heard a child go, I've got tummy ache, where no tummy ache exists, but they feel it in their gut. And they are feeling that this isn't neurological pain. This is actual pain that they are manifesting. So they're feeling cognitive dissonance here. And what happens is when you feel cognitive dissonance is your brain goes, nah, we need to get rid of this. And this is when you get that alienation manifesting, because the child will then just accept it, because it's easier to accept something than have to deal with that all the time. And it's not a conscious decision. It really isn't a conscious decision of going, well, I want to get rid of this pain, so I'll start just agreeing with that. It's something that, when I said the brain wants itself to survive, when it wants to survive, it chooses the path of least resistance. Yeah,
absolutely. So you've almost got a third option with the fight flight, because of the way this isn't necessarily, well, you've got this kind of acceptance almost, or this, like you say,
don't forget, for a child, they have no power. They can't walk out of the house. It's bad enough for a victim of abuse who's a functioning adult. Well, having been in that situation, you're not necessarily functioning, you're surviving. But
sure,
for a child, where do they go? Where do they go? And this is why the voice of the child is so important. But sometimes that voice of the child needs to be assessed by professionals, not by, and I'm generalizing here, and no doubt I'll get a lot of criticism, but welcome to my life. So not by people that are sociologists, not by people that are lawyers, by people that are actual child psychologists that are experts in development and trauma and child behavior. I'm not that expert, but that's what you need in that situation. Not
and
people that are
independent.
punting, not people that are wedded to an ideology, not people that think this exists or this doesn't exist, because
scientists,
people that know children. And I don't mean have worked with children, people that have studied and researched and know what's going on here. And there's a lot of debate going on, and it's so horrific on Twitter. And it's because everything's been polarized. So you'll get a whole load of people that say parent alienation will be used against battered women or women in domestic abuse services. Yeah, it will by male abusers. But equally, children will be used against men. And I say that because men tend to be the ones that have to leave the family home and are not the primary carer. That's seen as usual in our society. So that's why I'm saying it. But equally, men will have children used against them by women, and women will alienate them. It works both ways, always, across, down and through. And this is what we've got to get over. We've got to get over this fact that the people that are denying parental alienation may well have experienced their abuser, who is a man, using the term parental alienation against them, when all they're trying to do is keep their children safe. I know men that have been alienated by their partner, sometimes purposely, sometimes not purposely, which is a conversation I'd like to get onto, because they're bitter or lonely or sad or out for revenge, or actually don't even know they're doing it. They're not aware how their behavior is impacting on their children. And if we don't understand the full spectrum of this, there's only one group of people that are going to lose out on this, and it's children. And we're going to repeat that same old cycle over and over and over again. But that little bit I wanted to go back to there. I think it's really important to say that I think some parents, men and women, I would assume, and it is an assumption, predominantly women, that don't set out to alienate the other parent in this, but there's a system in place that not just allows them to do it, but actually nudges them down a path that I think they get taken and they can't pull out of. And it's this one about being in court, the family courts, who's funding this, who's benefiting from this. And again, this is a broad brush statement, and I'm hoping this is only a small fraction of this industry, but the legal family industry, law industry, needs a good bloody looking at, because since the legal aid was pulled, there's been a phenomenal increase in non-molestation orders, and you get a non-molestation order based on domestic abuse or some kind of abuse. And once you say it, or once it's happened, it's really difficult, because you're in a really intimidating situation. You're with a solicitor and a barrister and a judge and everything else. And who really wants to put their hands up and go, actually, that's not what I meant by that. You've spent 10 grand's worth of legal aid that you'd have to pay back if, you know, I think
everything's amplified to the nth degree.
So it's almost that, like, oh my God, did I say it? Did I mean it? Or too much? The solicitor's already put the application in. You've already got legal aid, and it's based on this. And oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Already got over on that roller coaster.
And then, so I mean, that's where the parents are. And then sitting just under that first level and that first layer, looking up at what's going on here, are these children.
There's a lot of people, male and female, that I call aged out children. So these are adults, and I'm talking any age from 20s all the way through to 60s and beyond, that have actually told me stories that have led them into not being able to hold down relationships, having some kind of addiction, and even things that could be considered good addictions, like being addicted to work, not just alcohol or drugs or anything else. Having incredible amounts of really surface level sexual relationships, not being able to commit to someone for fear and all that kind of stuff. And they really regret it, because they've got to a stage in their life where they haven't got a family. They really wish they had children. They can't have children anymore, all that kind of stuff. And they absolutely know where this has come from. And one person also said to me that they found out that their father was alive after he contacted them when they were in their 30s, but their mother had told them that they were dead. Now, not only did that child grieve that parent, but now as an adult, you're in a situation where, oh my God, you know, it's literally like they've resurfaced from the dead. And now you're looking at another parent that you were bonded with that's lied to you for how many years? So the level of cognitive dissonance that is happening there, what do you do with that, even as an adult? You know, you were a child who believed that parent, and they lied to you. They lied at such a level, so that can shatter your entire worldview. And
you love them, and you want them to be the best. You want them to be the hero. You want them to be perfect.
Other things, and this is just from anecdotal stuff people have told me, that then you question, did they ever love me? Did they really mean it when they said that? Am I this person? What is it? It sends off it just triggers so many other thoughts and feelings. How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
And that's as adults, not as young children that are going through this. But there are some offsets. You can try and do that with children. So there's things like there's this bit about having a AAA, and it means an always available, trusted adult. Right. And again, studies have shown that if you have an adult in your life, and it doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you live with, it can be a parent, a
teacher,
foster parent, a teacher, even like a community leader, a religious leader, even a social worker in a youth centre,
Sure.
Youth club, if they still have them. They should have them. I really do think we should have more youth clubs.
Absolutely.
Having that as an influence in your life, and we've seen this in films and stuff where, you know, children find someone that they latch onto and they form an incredible bond, and it just completely changed their lives. So you can have that, but also having routine. I'm a great believer in routine for children. My children are teenagers now. There is no routine. And every time I try and put one in place, they just roll their eyes at me and talk.
Don't oppress me, man.
No one says oppress in my house. But as I know for fact that when I was going through all the stuff with my first marriage and getting dragged through court and all the rest of it, the one thing that we had as the three of us, as a single mum with my two children, is we got up at the same time every day. We went through the same routine. My daughter went off to nursery. My son was at school. I went off to work. We came back home. We had dinner together. We had bath time. We had stories. We had sleep. I remember just being so exhausted I could barely move. But they knew their day had a structure, and they knew that this is when we had breakfast. This is when we had stories. This is when we did this. At the weekends, you know, it was just me and the kids. I was immensely lonely, but we'd go out in the garden and plant stuff and, you know, finger painting and baking and all the usual things. But they had time when they knew things were happening.
Yeah,
so regardless of all the stuff that they'd been through, because again, not only was I a victim of domestic abuse, they were too. All of a sudden, we all knew we were getting up at this time, we were doing this. You know, the weekends they would just pile into bed with me and we'd put something on and watch some. I'd have another 20 minutes while they were watching whatever over and over again.
Yeah.
You know, whatever.
Probably somebody playing a computer game.
yeah, whatever it was, they'd play that while I got, mummy's just having another half hour sleep before we get on with the weekend or whatever. So there's certain things you can put into place. Make sure they're getting.
So that's your AAA. That's your always available.
That's your always available adult. But getting a routine in place, good sleep, good food, everything else. But there's also things like you need a bigger circle when these things are happening, certainly for children. So you do need to inform the school. So you can have, most schools now have some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Pastoral care. Pastoral care.
So, I was going to say palliative care, but no, that's different.
Pastoral care.
Yeah.
So let the school know. I remember taking a real leap and letting the nursery know and the school know, you know, I'm a single mum now. I'm going through this. I'm going to need some help. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to get it. You know, people understand that things are going to happen. And actually having become friends with those people, it's really good because they will say, not only will they tell you if anything goes wrong, but they'll tell you that you're doing all right as well as a parent. So they'll go, oh, they're doing really well. You know, they're absolutely great. They were going like this, but actually you're right. We got them in the routine, and you can actually have, you know, for want of a corny phrase, it takes a village. So you can have all those things set up in place.
Yeah, it's really important actually to have all of. I mean, even down to sort of recognition type training within schools and settings like that around these issues, because they can be quite complex.
But I think it's informative as well, because my children hear a lot of what I talk about because I'm in the house, especially with lockdown and stuff. They've heard a lot of me teaching or me talking to people like yourself or whatever, or me just going through. I talk things out when I'm trying to formulate theories and things, so they hear a lot of that. But also that I think that might have generated an interest in things, especially because as they go through stages, I'm remarried now and have been for just over 6 years, and got a great family. It's all very calm in the house. It's not, you know, it's normal. It's just normal. It's not perfect. It's normal. So, but I think they're as they hit teenage years, they've got questions, and so I answer them. And I also talk to them not only about their behaviour, but if they come home and say such a body's been behaving like this at school, I always say to them, what's the reason? Do you think? Is there something going on? Is there, if they've got something going on at home, or and it might not be anything bad. It might just be that the parents are stressed out working from home all the time, or But and I always say to them, it might be a reason. It's not an excuse for bad behaviour, but it might be a reason. And actually, what that's breeding is a tolerance and understanding in them as children functioning in a school.
Yeah, and it allows them to question those behaviours as well,
but also be able to just say to their mates, "Are you all right?" So they're building their own peer group of supportive networks, which is so crucially important. If we've learned nothing from lockdown, it's how important certainly children are to each other, but certainly in the teenage years, how much their social structures are important for their well-being. So I think it might be it's worth. I would like to see something around this on the curriculum for schools. So alongside the subject's now called personal development, and it's got sex ed and all sorts of things involved in there. I would like some of this in there. I would like just a little bit top layer of this is what can happen as you're going through life. This is a little bit about attachment theory, to maybe understand relationships a bit more. And again, I'm not talking about an undergraduate module. I'm just talking about basic common sense.
Nice high level overviews of
high level overview.
And then these spark the interest, and they can take it from there.
Absolutely. So just having conversations with people and allowing, because I didn't know about all this until I went into psychology. It's and I think it should be something that's in, I don't know, parenting classes, or
it's amazing the impact
antenatal classes or something like that.
It's amazing the impact of what even a school assembly can provide. You can have.
You've given me an idea to start tapping up my kids' school now.
yeah. I mean, it helps. It helps a lot of people. It helps a lot of people. Wow, Deborah, this has been a really good insight into ACEs. I really like what we've covered today. I mean, we've gone through lots of the information and the infographics, etc., in the beginning, and around sort of why a lot of these things happen. We've delved really deep into what was it called, the telomeres?
Telomeres.
Telomeres, yes. That was super interesting.
I must warn you, if you go and hunt for that on YouTube or whatever, it's such a rabbit hole. Give yourself a lot of time, because it'll get you into all sorts of epigenetics and stuff. But it's fascinating. It really is. It's the micro world, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, I see lots of people like looking at, you'll see it on Facebook, and I'll go, "Hey, I'm just done with this series. Can anyone recommend a new series?" And I just think to myself, go and have a look at this, go and have a look at parental alienation, jump down that rabbit hole, because I think the link between ACEs and parental alienation, I think, is a really strong bind.
But it comes in, the message I'd like to leave on is that this comes in from both angles. Okay, so not only is this, like I said at the beginning, not only is this an effect of adverse childhood experiences as you grow up to be an adult, but it's also an outcome, and it comes in from both angles, or it's affected on both ways.
Yeah,
and this is where your intergenerational impact is involved.
Well said. You said that better than I could. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's something that's just generational, isn't it? Because you'd have to have that to sort of be that parent. There's something sitting behind those behaviors, consciously or unconsciously.
Maybe both. Who know? It depends on the individual.
No, I can see how that would be the case. Yeah, absolutely.
You can offset it, and there's a lot of work going on about resilience. And I often say to people that are really worried about the children, and there's a lot of people that are worried about the children, especially in relationships that have broken down, is that take some solace, and it's difficult to take solace in those situations, in the fact that children are adults a lot longer than they are children. But be prepared as a parent, certainly if you've been alienated, or certainly even if you've been accused of alienating when you haven't, be prepared to have some harsh, honest conversations when your children do become adults.
I think that's really good advice.
If that resource that Lancs commissioned, and they commissioned this off their own back, that we've pulled together, if that can help you in any way to just learn a bit more so you can have these conversations, then my work here is done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, arming yourself with these coping tools and these recognition tools are so valuable. You know, even if it's just down to how do you not react to you know, somebody who's kind of like got a misplaced aggression, or you know, some sort of adverse effect or what have you. You know, somebody who might be looking at you know, alcoholism or drug abuse and things like that, and actually just sort of like not necessarily see it as this superficial thing that's happening, but what's actually underneath that. You know, why that's being caused.
So often, bizarrely enough, that will get called toxic masculinity or whatever. And this is why I really push against toxic masculinity as an ultimately flawed and malicious concept, is that it purports to link that behavior to maleness and biology. It's certain, and bizarrely enough, by the people that actually say that there's no such thing as biology, they add toxic behavior to masculinity, which is innately maleness. When actually, if you stepped away from patriarchal theory and stepped into science, you would see that yes, men may react more with what is perceived as anger, rather than any other emotion. It might be more linked to men, but is that linked to adverse childhood effects? Is that linked to attachment? Is that linked to depression? Is that linked to something else? Rather than labeling it this utter horrible concept of toxic masculinity.
It's a hard one to get away from.
Well, not a fan.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. So how do we wrap this up? Because I'm conscious that I want to keep these fairly sort of nuggety, and maybe I'll take the opportunity to ask you, you know, what else is on your radar at the moment? What else is of interest? I mean, we sort of found a mutual interest with the ACEs, which has been fascinating. But what other sort of areas of development, whether it's childhood or family?
Well, I'm writing up some information for my thesis at the moment from the male victim studies that we did last year. And actually last night I was testing a new tool on I'm doing a qualitative chapter. Qualitative just means all the information that men have given me when they've typed in their answers, rather than just yes or no or whatever level. Yeah. I'm analysing that. So I've taken all the different themes out of that about men, but I'm using a linguistic analysis tool around sentiment. And often we have hypotheses about something that fail. You know, that's what statistical tests are about. You're testing something, and if it's not significant, then you either quit that, or you go back, or you find something else to study, and that's science. You will fail as often as you succeed, probably more so. Sure. But yesterday I was testing that on one of the questions in our first survey was were male victims frightened of their partner, their abusive partner or ex-partner? And I asked that question because often it's said that men don't feel fear like women do. And actually, that's true. Men don't feel fear like women do. But I've found some evidence that says where women tend to fear a perpetrator, men tend to fear the actions of the perpetrator. Now, that seems subtle, but it's really important, because it's a difference between fearing the person and fearing the behavior of the person. And why that's important on various levels is the questionnaires that are set up for reporting the statistics, or changing policies or practice, or even providing support services for victims, are based on the female model. So there'll be questions in there that ask if you're frightened of the perpetrator, if you're frightened that they made, they are this, which a man would say no to. And then they would go, oh, he's not frightened. He's just frightened in a different way. Okay. However, I've used this new package, and I'll write this better because it's still brand new. So I'm kind of muddling how I'm going to describe it. But we have population averages on the sentiments that people express when they're doing different types of writing, be that expressive writing, blogs, news articles, and even social media. So you have an average of just someone, ordinary people, not a victim population, just a general population. And then I've taken the UK answers, but I'll do this for all the global results. And I've done the sentiment tracking on them. And it actually produces a mathematical score. And then I've compared the score that men have expressed just in that one question, I'm doing it for several, against the population, normal general population average. And it's statistically significantly different. So what that means for us is that male victims are using language differently than the general public. So I've picked up that men that have been victims of abuse when describing fear use first person pronouns more often. That doesn't really make sense until I tell you that there's research that shows that people that used first person pronouns at an increased rate are demonstrating a higher degree of depression. So you can then see how linguistic capacity of men that have been victimized could be picked up by counselors, could be picked up by psychologists. And so you may get to the point where on a questionnaire, it looks like they're hunky-dory, but actually you're aware of the linguistics that you pick up, that you can identify, well, actually, they were using first-person pronouns more. They were using this more. Okay, I'm going to analyze that, and it's going to tell me a different question that you might not even be aware of yourself.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting.
It's exciting for a geek like me.
Yeah, well, you know what? I mean,
when that answer comes up and it's significant, it's literally like, woohoo!
Yeah. So, as a man, I might not be afraid of a partner hitting me physically or what have you, but I might be afraid of her further actions, i.e., reputation disruption.
It's even more subtle than that. So if you ask a question, and this question exists along several different formats for domestic abuse, are you afraid of your partner? Women are far more likely to say yes than men, because men will say, no, I'm not afraid of her, but I'm afraid she might stab me in my sleep. So they're still afraid of that person, but it's linguistically and cognitively, it's based more on the actions. Also, there's significant differences, and I mean statistically significant differences, because men are far more likely to be afraid to leave that relationship because they're going to lose their children. Or they're afraid that the abusive partner, and in this instance, I'm talking about an abusive woman, might abuse the children if they leave. So they stay in situ to at least protect the children.
Yeah. Goodness.
So they act.
That's very important work.
Well, yeah, it is, and it's really exciting. It really is. I know it sounds really geeky that I'm sat here tweaking with linguistics and sentiment and all that stuff, but
Of course, there's no getting away from that. It's absolutely
I'm
geeky.
full on geek. Yeah,
Yeah.
I revel in my geekiness.
Yeah, but I think it's going to have some really important, nuanced outcomes.
Yeah,
because that's what we have to look at. I mean, if we're just going to read the headlines, we're going to get one side of the, we're going to get one image of the story.
None of this is based on patriarchal theory. It's based on scientifically robust evidence.
Yeah. We need to get some debates happening. But I know, Deborah, you're going to be joining. Well, at least I hope that you'll be able to join us in the next quarterly panel show.
Definitely.
I'm hoping to put together a few bits and pieces, but that might be something that we can touch upon there as well at that point. But otherwise,
again, it's worth having, because all these conversations are part of the same issue, but it's been polarized by political beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is so much out there that just sort of like fights against what is actually, once you've sort of lived it and gone through it, what is actually a very serious matter that's just being sort of well, it's just being bastardized by these sort of weird agenda-led resistance platforms, where people are just sort of fighting against it just for the sake of fighting against it, just because you say the M word.
We'll talk about that a bit more, I think, at the next one. But there's a lot more on the surface. It seems very much like that, but actually, the cognition that comes with that is quite complex.
Well, it's for you to explain that to me, definitely.
Yeah, that's fine.
I look forward to it. Deborah, is there anything else you'd like to say before we before we cut that one going? Well, then all that's left is for me to thank you for joining me on the Philip Maloney podcast, and I hope that our viewers have found that of value. And obviously, there's going to be a wealth of information in the description of this video. And all that leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching. Do like the video, share it, and subscribe if you want to see more content around this area. Thanks very much for watching the Philip Maloney podcast.
On a train, in a bus, in a car, on the way to your job. All alone with your kids, with your wife, or with your dog. You can listen anywhere, you can listen everywhere, to the Philip Maloney podcast.